Quick question for all you Marvel fans out there. Who's the worst father in the MCU? There are certainly many less than stellar examples, and some may be quick to point out the failings of the Mad Titan Thanos, but for some reason many fans seem to give a pass to Odin, and we're here to say he just might be the worst dad in MCU history. Prior to the first Thor movie, even non-comic book fans knew who Odin was. He was a powerful god in Norse mythology, and Norse gods tend to be pretty badass as a rule. Odin was an ultra-powerful being with a powerful spear, a magic cloak, ferocious animal sidekicks, and yet he was sensitive enough to enjoy writing poetry in his spare time. Come on, ladies, get you a man like Odin who can do it all. Obviously, we're gonna be talking about the MCU version of Odin, but we just wanted to point out that most people had some idea of what Odin was gonna be like going into the first Thor movie, and that impression was favorable. We could go on all about the strange things Odin has done in Norse mythology, but that's for another day. Now let's get back to the MCU.
I now take from you your power.
Odin is the son of Bor, the former king of Asgard. He was one of several brothers, but the rest perished during times of war, as did Bor eventually. You would think this might have turned Odin off the topic of war altogether, since it already cost him his entire family, but you'd be wrong. We aren't saying that war is never necessary, or that Odin didn't do some heroic things back in his day. He assumed the throne of Asgard after the death of Bor, defeated the mighty fire demon Surtur, and even took the eternal flame of Muspelheim. If you recall, this is pretty much exactly what Thor does during the movie Thor Ragnarok, so just picture that again, but with Odin instead of Thor. Like young Anthony Hopkins. During Thor Ragnarok, we also learned that Odin's family tree was a little bit more complicated than we once assumed. When we met his family during Thor, we were introduced to his wife, Frigga, and his sons Thor and Loki, but apparently, Odin had an older daughter by the name of Hela, who he just tried his best to pretend didn't exist.
Really? You don't look like him.
Hela will be neither seen nor heard. While Hela lived in Asgard, she was the apple of her father's eye and his right hand. He raised her to wage war and conquer, and the two relished in conquering the 9 realms together. During Thor Ragnarok, Odin admits he perhaps focused a bit too much on violence when raising Hela, which is one of the understatements of the century, really. Eventually, Odin wisened up and decided he was sick of ruling Asgard with violence, but Hela didn't feel the same way. Odin had failed to teach his daughter anything beyond violence, so naturally at this point, reasoning with her didn't work, but he couldn't kill her because she was his daughter and he loved her. Oh wait, yeah, just kidding. The only thing stopping Odin from murdering his child was the fact that he lacked the power to do so. Hela was an essential part of the Ragnarok prophecy. She had to survive, so he did the fatherly thing and sent his daughter to her room, and by her room we meant hell. Now, we're not here to argue about nature versus nurture. Maybe there's a slight chance that Odin could have been the best father in the world, and Hela would have turned into a murderous psychopath anyway. We doubt it, but let's just say it's a possibility. What he did next was worse than sealing his daughter away in hell, which is definitely saying something. He simply erased her entire existence and pretended he never had a daughter. Imagine if, when you went to college, your family took down all your photos and threw out your baby books and just did their best to act like you didn't exist. Change the locks, they're finally gone, woo! And we could maybe understand Odin not wanting to talk about Hela with the general public of Asgard, but he left his new children completely in the dark on the subject. When Loki and Thor met Hela in Ragnarok, they were blown away to discover their father had a child they never knew existed. Odin decided ruling Asgard alone was too much of a burden, so he got a beautiful younger wife and a couple more kids, so he could forget about old what's-her-name and raise a proper heir to the throne of Asgard. Straight up making a new family and pretending your old one doesn't exist is utterly horrific, and the only justification for it is pure selfishness. Odin didn't want to face up to his parenting failures, so he ensured that his other kids would have to clean up his mess for him.
Thor.
Access denied.
Now we'll get to the abysmal way Odin has treated Loki in a bit, but for now we're gonna focus on his favorite child, Thor. He's been in many great Marvel movies since his first appearance, and he's evolved into a rather popular and likable character. But what about when we first met him? There's no denying he was a massive jerk in the first movie, and why wouldn't he be? Odin made sure he was brought up to believe he was better than everyone else, so Thor understandably had a rather entitled attitude. Plus all the muscles and the chiseled good Helmsworth looks probably didn't help either. After he messed up his first kid so badly, you'd think Odin would have learned his lesson, but he failed to teach his son anything about humility, peace, or basically anything that would make him a good ruler. In fact, the takeaway at the end of the movie was that even Thor realized he would be a horrible ruler. Odin literally had one job, which was to make sure Thor could rule Asgard, and he completely bungled it. It isn't until Odin breaks out his favorite punishment, banishment, that Thor becomes an even halfway decent person. Basically, the further away from Odin his kids get, the better they seem to fare. Odin notes that he felt learning about Asgard's history was important to being a solid ruler, but then he left out the cautionary tale that was his first child. Talk about a massive oversight oversight that had serious ramifications for not only Thor but Asgard as a whole. And let's not forget that in the movie Thor, Odin was ready and willing to hand the crown of Asgard over to Thor. Even Thor knew he wasn't fit to rule, so what was Odin thinking? Does he have any idea of that actually be a capable ruler? Or did he just get lucky when he fell into the role when he was the only one left in his family? Even here on the relatively primitive Earth, we have a saying for those who don't learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So you'd think Odin would know a potential ruler should at least have an accurate understanding of history. Thor's always heralded as Odin's favorite child, but frankly he was treated pretty abysmally by Odin, who absolutely set him up to fail. The fact that Thor had any degree of success in his life is impressive because, frankly, his own family was working against him. And speaking of family working against him, now let's get into the part where we talk about Odin's least favorite child, Loki.
I am Loki of Jotunheim, and I bring you a gift.
While Odin was at least pretending to prepare Thor for ruling Asgard, he raised Loki like a second-class citizen. He pawned him off on Frigga to teach him magic and made it clear he expected great things from Thor, but as for Loki, well, we're not really sure what his career goals for Loki were. Loki clearly didn't either, since he seemed to feel usurping the throne from Thor was the only option. And look, we get that adoption can be complicated, but it's not as though Odin adopted little baby Loki out of the kindness of his heart. Not only did he treat Loki as though he wasn't part of the family, he flat out told him he was a little more than a war trophy. After the big reveal about his lineage, Loki demands to know why Odin took him in. Odin tries to suggest he took an innocent child out of the goodness of his heart, but you can't kid a kidder or trick a trickster god apparently. Loki demands to know the real reason, and Odin tells Loki he was essentially a political pawn he hoped he could someday be leveraged into making peace with the frost giants. Now, after all this, you would think that Loki would be furious with Odin and not Thor, but don't forget that Odin is the only father he's ever known, and even though he's been the family's scapegoat for years, he's still desperate for his father's love and approval. It's a lot easier to blame the golden child sibling instead of the parent who set up the ridiculous dynamic in the first place. At the end of the movie, Loki was so devastated by his father's rejection, he would rather plunge himself into a dark abyss than live anymore. But of course, since this is a Marvel movie, we know Loki didn't stay gone for long. When he got back, Odin felt the need to tell him that, if it were up to him, he would gladly kill him. But because Frigga loved him, he would simply imprison him forever. Now, we're in no way saying that Loki is a fine, upstanding Asgardian citizen, but honestly, after the way he was raised, it's a miracle he isn't much worse. His dad ignored and belittled him his entire life, and then he told him he wanted to murder him. We know this made Loki crave power and approval, but he could probably benefit a lot more from some therapy. Not only was Odin incredibly hurtful to his youngest son, it was hypocritical of him to read Loki the riot act and act as though he was beyond redemption when he himself once committed such atrocities. Never mind that he could have just imprisoned Loki and left out his feelings on the subject. When Loki came back to save the day at the end of Thor Ragnarok, we were pleasantly surprised, but maybe we shouldn't have been.
But he got...
After all, without Odin fueling their fights, there was a chance for these two brothers to actually have a decent relationship with one another. At this point, how much blood is on Odin's hands anyways? He's the reason Hela laid waste to the Valkyries, and numerous other people in Asgard. We can also attribute at least some of Loki's actions and motivations to Odin's horrific excuse for parenting, as he also set Thor up for failure. So there's no denying Odin is a monster as far as his kids are concerned. But what about his effect on the MCU in general?
I will no longer be your slave!
Some people believe that there was a point when Odin had collected the Infinity Stones for himself, perhaps back when he was trying to conquer everything in sight. During Thor Ragnarok, we saw a fake Infinity Gauntlet in his vault, leading many to believe it was a replica of one he once owned. It's debatable whether he had one or many Infinity Stones, but we know for sure that he at least had the Space Stone at one point. During the mid-credit scenes of Thor: The Dark World, we see Sif and Volstagg delivering the Reality Stone to the Collector, and they remark that it's not a good idea to keep two Infinity Stones close together. This could explain why Odin hid the Space Stone on Earth, but why did he leave it somewhere so easily discovered? Think of all the carnage and evil that resulted because Odin couldn't have at least stuck a couple guards near the Infinity Stone. He clearly wasn't even keeping track of it anymore since he let it fall into the hands of the Red Skull and later Thanos and Loki. Does Odin have no responsibility for this dangerous magical artifact which was once in his possession at one point? And just in case you think it's Earth Odin doesn't care about, let's talk about how great of a ruler of Asgard he is. During Thor: The Dark World, he becomes overcome with the need for vengeance. After losing Frigga, he decides to lead the Asgardians into battle against the Dark Elves. This sounds okay until you figure out that even Odin realizes there's no way for them to actually win. But of course Odin isn't gonna let a little thing like certain doom stop him. He tells Thor that he has no problem spilling every last drop of Asgardian blood in a battle they have no hope of winning. And this is the guy who's supposed to be protecting Asgard? You'd have better luck with Ramsay Bolton. What more evidence do we need of Odin's cruelness and incompetence? Loki ruled Asgard for years in his stead and nobody even noticed. Not to diminish Loki's capabilities, but what does this say about Odin? At best he's ineffectual, and at worst he's actively trying to destroy Asgard. When it comes to MCU villains, Odin is one of the worst because he constantly masquerades as a good character. Growing up on Asgard sounds like being a child of Thanos to us. What do you think is the worst example of parenting in the MCU? Odin or Thanos? Tell us your pick in the comments below, then click on the subscribe button for more MCU content from CBR. Thanks for watching.